Round 2 of the FIDE World Cup is over, and already some big beasts have exited the tournament. For example, Hikaru Nakamura is now out. Nihal Sarin, that we saw in a previous video, he's now out. And well, today there was some tie breaks, and I'm going to take you through one of the matches that reached a really dramatic conclusion. So this is the match between Yevgeny Najer from Russia, very experienced player, former individual European champion, and he was playing against Anish Giri. So they drew their first two classical games, they drew the two 25-minute games, they drew the two 10-minute games, so they went into a 2-game blitz match, 5 minutes on the clock, plus 3 seconds each time they make a move. So let me take you through what happened in the first of those blitz games. Najer with white. Now, he's a very cultured player. On paper, Giri is far stronger, but I think not an easy opponent for Giri. Now, we joined the game after 19 moves, and Najer has already taken a pawn, but it's a pretty hot pawn to take because there is an open B file towards white's king, and Najer has still to get his king's bishop and king's rook into the game. Bishop f6 from Giri, pointing down at b2. And here, well, surely white's got to just go bishop c4, and if necessary, block out that b file. But queen e4 played instead. Queen c7 connects the rooks. Rook came up to d3. Well, given all the time in the world, you might be able to get away with that move. You might be able to block here, but it looks pretty ugly. And now Giri took the initiative. The rook hits the queen. And now black played queen d7. And d5. That pawn might advance, you never know, to dislodge the bishop. g3, okay, that bishop, again, if it can come into the game, if white has time, then he's doing extremely well with the two bishops, but suddenly we have an attack on b2, and this is problematic. Well, the move we would like to play is bishop c1, but that opens up the e file. So that's tricky. Rook b3 looks like it should be the move to block out that rook, but in that case that could be taken. And if queen takes, then rook number 2 comes over, not too good. And if pawn takes, then there's queen f5 and queen c2. Ooh, nasty! b2 is caving in. So what did Najer do? Well, he played pawn to b4. Golly. Well, if it's good, it's very good, but if it's bad, it's very bad. And it was very bad. Knight takes b4 was a killer move, opening up this diagonal. And after queen takes queen, well, white might have taken a queen, but he's losing his king. It's a disaster for white. And this is a forced checkmate. And Giri wrapped things up very well like this. Rook b8, and now, well, white can only just stave off mate for a couple of moves by putting pieces in the way, but you can see white's king has no move here. So here Najer resigned the game. So that meant that going into the next game, Giri just needed to draw this next blitz game and he would go through. Well, Najer played extremely well and reached a rook and pawn endgame, double rooks on the board. Najer has this extra pawn, but so still technically a little bit tricky. But Najer played this move, rook h2, in a blitz game, a very, very difficult move to meet. You don't know. Do you put the king up the board? Do you put the king up the back rank? Looks a bit unpleasant. Or do you block? Well, Giri blocked. Remember, he just needs a draw. If the rooks are exchanged, then the king gets closer to the pawn, looks like it could be a good idea, but no. Rook b2 check is an excellent way of simplifying the position. And Najer flashed out rook back to d8, making sure the rook is as far away from the king as possible. White king is cut off here, and it just needs the pawn and king to shuffle down the board, and that is a win, and the game duly ended like this. There's not a lot that Giri can do now. A few random checks, but Najer made no mistake, and the pawn just crawling down the board. Simple win. So that meant that Najer had levelled the scores, and they then went into an Armageddon game to decide who would go through. So lots were drawn, and Najer had the white pieces, so that meant he had 5 minutes to Giri's 4 minutes, but Giri had draw odds. If the game ended in a draw, then Giri would go through. So Najer in a must-win situation. No increment until move 61, and then 2 seconds would be added. So no increment till move 61. So it starts out as an English. Giri was playing pretty quickly. Well, he had a minute less. But Najer was quite hesitant over this opening. And it has turned out pretty well for Giri, and very much his kind of chess, quite strategic, quite positional. He has control over the d4 square. Najer exchanging, but in order to win that bishop, well, he ceded control over d4. This knight is on the edge of the board, and this has been a pretty good outcome for Giri. He's also ahead in development and can start play on the queen side. I mean, here, it's even possible to exchange off knight for bishop. You can also play d5 in this position. Basically, this is a very comfortable position for black. Giri took on b5. This is also absolutely fine. And here, again, d5 looks like a very comfortable move. He played a4. Typical Giri, very positional. Just picking off a square here. So he just wants to make sure that this bishop has potentially a nice square on b3, and this pawn is a little bit stranded as well. So what can white do here? Well, really the only way to go is with a pawn break, either f4 or d4. Well, Najer plays f3, which, given all the time in the world, then d4 is a nice move to make, but it feels very slow, and Giri immediately pounced on this. By the way, if queen b6 check here, then it doesn't win a pawn because white will advance with d4 to cover that pawn. But knight h5, very logical move once the bishop has gone in this direction, and these squares on the king side a little bit weak, then seems like a nice move. Particularly, as the queen joins the struggle as well. So black is playing with these 3 pieces on the king side, and potentially the f-pawn advancing as well. So already Najer, well, he was down on time. So Giri started with a minute less, but actually by this stage Najer had overtaken him and he was down on time. So far so good for Giri, and he's threatening to play knight takes pawn, which would force a draw. Remember, a draw is all Giri needs. Bishop c1, attacking the queen, which nudged back to g6. King h1, avoiding the perpetual here. But f5, of course, is a very logical move just to add some more firepower to the king side. Potentially to bring that rook up the board as well. For example, here, f4 played by Najer. Now, obviously, the game is reaching absolute crisis point where white has opened up the diagonal, threatening to take the knight. And now Giri had to decide, Does he plunge in or does he come back? Now, he simply doesn't have the time to sit and calculate. And so he decided to just bring the knight back. And a practical move, because his position is still very attractive. He didn't want to risk going in. In fact, this also looks like it could be rather good fun for black. The best that white can do is, well, probably rook f3. And then the rook comes up. This looks extremely dangerous. But Giri played practically, brought the knight back to f6, because these light squares are starting to open up. And black's development is better than white's. Bishop b2, and now Giri decided to attack with knight g4. Lots of attractive moves here for white. Bishop h3, maybe bishop g4 as well to trade off those bishops. Did I mention the e4 yet? Also interesting. Anyway, knight g4 played and e4 played on this turn. So he's trying to get through to the king on these light squares. So very interesting that Giri, instinctively, but also very practically playing, positional strategic chess here. And rook c8. Well, that looks pretty attractive to put a rook down there. So rook c1 and now d5, cementing that bishop on this beautiful square. And now actually, if Najer had had a little bit more time, he might have found f5, which kind of disrupts black's position a little bit. But bishop d4 is one of those moves that you play, very quickly in blitz because it seems so solid. You close this diagonal. You somehow, keep this knight under lock and key. The bishop controls these knight squares. But actually, it allows black just a moment where he can take the initiative, which Giri did very well here. Now, he could play queen h5. If he was going to continue in kind of more strategic mode, you could play like this. And after h4, it's difficult to defend that pawn. Moving the bishop somewhere, not easy. This rook could be taken. And after h4, then you could nudge the queen back with g6 to look at that pawn. And this knight is beautifully placed. But no, Giri decided now that it was time to seize the initiative. And with Najer running short of time, then this did look very attractive. So let's see what happens. Giri gives up a piece and plunges in with his queen. It looks pretty good. The king goes back. Well, in weekend tournament chess in England, we always used to say good compensation for a piece is 2 pawns and a check. Well, black has 2 pawns and he's got a check. So that means he's got the initiative. And considering this bishop is in such a strong position and, yeah, the queen very actively placed, it doesn't look bad for black. So I think a good practical decision. In fact, rook f2 would keep white very much in the game here. Bishop f2 played instead, and Giri swiped off pawn number 3 and also hits that rook. And here bishop e3 would kind of hold the fort, but no, rook takes c8. And now with this rook potentially coming down here, that pawn potentially advancing, this starts to look extremely dangerous for white. And here, well, bishop e3 to cover rook c1 is actually really the only move that white can try. Rook g1 played by Najer, but now rook c1 check is absolutely deadly. Bishop f3, and this pin is fatal. At first it looks like rook g3 might save white with this pin, but in fact just a little tactic after this. Here, a queen check. Once you've got the queen out of the pin, then black is going to take here. And after queen d2, queen b1 check would be mate. So in fact, rook g3 would not save white. Najer tried rook g7. And now it just needs, well, in fact, there are several moves that are safe for black here. Giri step back with the king, and white is still completely lost in this position. That bishop is going to fall, and it'll be mate very shortly. So, dramatic finish. Giri survived some hairy positions in those games, but he pulled through at the end. So Giri goes through into round 3. Remember, if you want to subscribe to the channel, then do click on that subscribe button. And if you want to support us, do check out the links in the video description to either PayPal or Patreon.com. Thanks for watching.